Hey Wargamers, welcome to the Epic Hobbies 4 Epic Minutes. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make a do-it-yourself wet palette. The whole project will cost about $5. You can pick up everything from your local dollar store. All you're going to need is a plastic food container, some thin sponges or absorbent cloth, and some parchment paper. You want to get about the shallowest container you can find, but in this case I'm actually going to use the lid as the palette and use the container as the lid. The lid itself is definitely deep enough to hold a little bit of water in my sponge, and the container just covers it up when I'm not using it. The first thing I do is just rip off some parchment paper and cut it to size so it fits inside the lid or inside the container. I'm doing the parchment paper first instead of the sponge because there's 30 meters of it, and if I get it wrong, there's a lot more to play with. You can either take accurate measurements with a ruler or just eyeball this, however you feel like doing it, just make sure it fits well. You want to make sure it fits wholly within your container and doesn't overlap the edges. Once the parchment paper has been cut to size, you can use it as a template to cut your fabric or sponge. Here I'm laying the absorbent fabric 2 layers deep and then cutting it to size. When you're using a thin fabric like this, having multiple layers of it helps you have a bigger water reservoir, which keeps your paint wet longer. Once that's cut to size, you're going to want to place it inside your container and then start adding water. It's actually possible to oversaturate the sponge, and I do that here in this video. My paints at the end up a little bit too watery. That's easy to fix by just blotting some water away with another sponge or draining it off if there's any liquid water. You want the entire sponge or fabric to be damp, but not actually swimming in water. You don't want it floating, you don't want there to be actual puddles, and here I have definitely added just a little bit too much. The exact amount of water you're going to want to add is going to depend on the depth of your sponge and what kind of fabric you use or what kind of sponge you use, so it's going to take a little trial and error to kind of dial in your own experience. Once the sponge or fabric is thoroughly wet, it's just a matter of putting the parchment paper in place and holding it for a couple seconds so it doesn't curl up again. Once the parchment paper itself has absorbed a little water, it'll hold to the sponge or fabric quite well. Now it's time to test the wet palette out. I'm going to add a couple drops of paint and then leave this overnight for 24 hours to see how it holds up. The neat side effect of using the container as the lid and vice versa is that the container itself is actually more transparent and I can see what paints are in here at a glance much easier. Because these are so cheap, I can build a whole bunch of them and have one wet palette for each project I'm working on. Okay, it's been a full day at this point, so I'm going to open up the wet palette, grab a paintbrush, and test these paints out. You can see now that it's been a full day later and the paints are still very liquid. If anything, they're a little too liquid. And I do chalk this up to just adding a little bit too much water to my wet palette in the first place. Again, this is a little bit of a trial and error process because different fabrics or different sponges will sort of allow a different amount of water to bleed up into the parchment paper, and it's just going to take a little bit of time and effort on your own part to figure out what works for the wet palette you build. Here I'm testing the blue paint on a miniature I just had sitting nearby. It is a little bit on the thin side, again just because it picked up a little bit of water from the palette itself, but it's actually the perfect consistency for glazing and definitely stood up better than it would have just sitting out overnight. Thanks for watching, and until next time, do something epic.